Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
An American, a Brit, and a Dutch guy go for a walk. Kind of sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? I'm sure it does. But actually, this is the end of a USC-led study that really could impact the future of research on physical activity. The reason I say that is it deals with our subject today, which is perception versus measuring. Now, the reason I brought up the American, the Brit, and the Dutch guy go for a walk is that they had a study they did out at USC where they took several people, hundreds of people, that were American, that were Dutch, and that were English. And they were asking them about how active they were. Now, this goes to my subject matter today because the results were rather disparaging. The Americans all seemed to overpredict how active they were. They overestimated how active they were. What they did now in this test, they had everybody write down how active they thought they were. Then they actually attached Fitbits to them and measured their movement, and then went back and looked over the findings and found out that the Americans typically overestimated their exercise. The Dutch and English seem to underestimate their amount of exercise. Now, the reason this was interesting, while there's nothing against picking on my home country, that's for sure, and there's simple reasons why that was the case. Americans, when they're doing their day-to-day activities, typically we drive more. We don't walk as much. We don't have cars. A lot of the areas where we live aren't conducive to walking or biking, so we end up using cars more. The Dutch and English, because of their communities and the way that things are set up, they're more apt to ride a bike for transportation or go for a walk for transportation. And therefore, when they were actually tracking or trying to guess how active they weren't including such things as the biking and walking, because it was things that just they weren't figuring, they weren't counting on, they weren't making it into the calculations, I guess you'd say. The reason I start this topic and the reason I'm talking about this today is that perception versus what I call measuring, and it's perception versus reality, but perception versus measuring can be very dangerous. And it's something I see a lot of, so much so that I've added it to our Catalyst Lifestyle Change program. We actually talk about perception versus measuring. There are countless times that I have people come and sit in my office and I'll talk about, one of my favorite subjects, and you hear it from every episode. All right, folks, we're starting early today. I'm at 60 ounces. I hope you're keeping up. Every time you hear me take a drink, I want you to drink some water also. Stay hydrated. It is the magic pill. But whenever I talk to anybody about drinking water, imagine what they say. You should take in a good bit of water during the day. And religiously, their answer is, I drink plenty of water. I don't think I've met any of the 50% of the adult population in the U.S. that does not drink enough water. I haven't met any of those individuals. I think everybody I meet drinks enough water. They believe they do, and I can understand that. I can understand why they think that. So it goes back to that same study we were talking about. We're not tracking it. We're not measuring it. Therefore, they're not seeing that. They aren't seeing exactly what they are doing. As with everything, I like to start off with some definitions. Let's talk about the definition of perception and the definition of reality. Perception is the way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something, or else a mental impression. And reality is the world or the state of things as they actually exist. Existence that is absolute, self-sufficient, or objective, and not subject to human decisions or conventions. Now, how is that important in what I do for a living? Well, it's incredibly important. In fact, if you've heard my podcast on the live aging, and if you think about the 4 different parts of ability, which are fitness, nutrition, lifestyle, and mindset, you would see where perception versus measuring, or perception versus reality, is extremely important and actually could possibly be causing a lot of the problems we're having. Water consumption is one. And I find this to this day. I've been taking in over 100 ounces of water a day now for well over 20 years. And still, and those people that I know of that do this, not just me, still, I have to have a system to track it daily. If I'm not tracking it daily, I am not maintaining my water intake. And this is true for everybody that's successful at doing this, at taking in this normal amount of water, which is 100 ounces a day. Think about eating, or overeating for that matter. It's amazing the people that I speak to and how many people I speak to, and I understand why they answer this way. I don't fault them. But if you ask them if they overeat, they'll tell you no, absolutely not. They may be overweight, but they genuinely do not believe they overeat. Well, the first thing I do is, how do you know? That's the first thing I ask. How do you know? How can you possibly know whether or not you overeat? Well, unless you're tracking it, you're not going to know. It's just like it goes back to the water bottle. If I'm not tracking it, I'm not going to be able to understand the reality of how much water I'm taking in, just like how much food I'm taking in. This is why this answer is very common, and it frustrates a lot of fitness professionals. It frustrates a lot of health professionals to hear somebody say to them, I don't overeat. But I can understand that. It makes perfect sense why somebody believes or perceives that they don't overeat. But perception can be dangerous in other ways too. Perception is something that causes a problem in our field of what I refer to as the Hollywood trainer. Now, 35% of our clientele is over the age of 65, and we've had at least that many, if not more, or at least a higher percentage in the 20 years we've been in business. Still, I have individuals that are that age that know us, that are interested in working out, interested in doing this, that live nearby, what have you. No excuses whatsoever to come and get started with us. And still, they refrain out of fear. And I've talked about this in the past, and speaking to some of my senior clientele, I always wondered, wait a second now, I had a couple people start, and they finally got started with me. And I've been talking to them for years about getting started. And both these two individuals I sat down and spoke with are over the age of 80. I'd been talking to one of them for at least 7 years about coming in and working out. And I sat down with both of them and talked to them about, okay, why did you finally decide to come in? And why, more importantly, had you not come in earlier? And their answer was simple. The only idea, the only concept they had of a personal trainer was that of a drill sergeant or a high school coach. And in both situations, those individuals were bullies. Now, there's popular television shows that have trainers, or even movies for that matter, that show trainers are gigantic and typically aggressive, can be rather forceful, yelling and screaming at people.
Are you saying you're not giving people the Arlie Ermy treatment from Full Metal Jacket?
Well, don't get me wrong. I am a capitalist. I'll give them what they're paying for. But no, that's not our standard operating procedure. Absolutely not.
So. Joker.
Exactly. Well, this is what kept these gentlemen from coming to see me. Again, perception. And I sat in front of one of them. They were talking about, they got into descriptions of trainers. And when he came to see me, this is a person that's known me for a long time. If you've seen me in person, I'm not that gigantic of an individual. I'm a good 165, soaking wet at a towering 5'6". And he sat in my office and did the throwing up of hands, I call it. Somebody will sit down, and then when we get to starting to talk about their program, the first thing they do is they put both palms up facing me in a weight kind of imagery here, kind of motion, and say, now hang on, I don't want to get big. I don't want to bulk up. And I always find that funny, because if that were my goal for everyone, and especially for the vast number of people that we interview that have that exact same comment, then don't you think I would be a much more massive individual than I am? Right now, I think that would definitely be the situation. But again, where did they get these ideas? They got these perceptions from Hollywood. They got these perceptions from growing up. They got these perceptions from somewhere else, and not the reality, not really looking at the exact situation. And I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, I know, but when I started seeing a lot of continuity in thought with these different ideas, the water consumption, the overeating, people that are afraid if they lift weights they're going to get bulky, people that are afraid of a trainer, all these things dealt with perception. And I call this actually perception versus measuring, but it's also in the case of picking a trainer and thinking about different types of fitness programs, whether or not weightlifting will make me bulky. That's perception versus reality. And I believe that it was important enough to talk about it in a podcast was just to make people aware that these can be dangerous. This can be extremely dangerous. And there's ways of handling it. Definitely in the fitness field, there's definitely ways to handle perception versus measuring. For instance, I'll go back to tracking the water. Obviously, we have a great way of doing that. We have water bottles that we track with rubber bands, and therefore, when somebody finishes a bottle, they move one rubber band from the bottom to the top, or the top to the bottom, however they're measuring it, and that lets them know how they're doing as far as their water consumption. But something else. How about being skinny? How about being skinny, and how a lot of people think that equals healthy? Now, don't get me wrong. Vanity is my favorite sin, but skinny is a 4-letter word. I've had countless people that you would refer to as skinny tell me how that is a 4-letter word. And what we don't know when we're talking about skinny or looking at somebody that we say is skinny, therefore they're healthy, that doesn't really tell us anything. That is a perception. That is a perception that they are healthy simply because they're skinny, when we really don't know if they are. And this can be dangerous. I'll give you a for instance. Back in 1998, I had a lady that was just in her 50s, young as far as I'm concerned, and she was skinny. And most people would think, very pretty lady, but most people, including herself, thought, well, I'm in good shape, I'm healthy. At 50 years old, with no debilitation whatsoever, she could not physically get off the floor. She did not have enough strength to be able to get off the floor. No hip injuries, no back, no knee injuries, no nothing. Just could not get off the floor. But why did she not think this was a concern? Well, 2 reasons. Number one thing that was important to her was that number on the scale. And it had been under 120 for so many years that no matter what we did, we could not go over that number, no matter how she looked, no matter how she felt, no matter what kind of shape she got in. Under 120 equals I am skinny, and everybody tells me that's healthy. Everybody tells me that looks good. That is the perception that I have where in this case the reality was killing her. The second thing is did not care whether or not she actually gained strength. Couldn't use the word build because built meant bulk, meant bad, meant big because that was her perception of it. Therefore, had to keep her under 120 and we could not do anything related to the word build. A very difficult situation and one that ultimately will kill somebody unless they're able to deal with the perception versus the reality. In the same breath, a very good client of mine for many years confided in me. If I were to mention her name in my small town, a lot of people would know of her. And oh my gosh, you were her trainer? Oh, she was so fit. Oh my Lord, she was so skinny. She was incredible. What was interesting about that is that how many people would tell her that, but they would call her out at parties and make a big spectacle of it. I mean, a huge spectacle of it. Well, you think, well, that sounds good. I would love to have that. I got you. I understand that. But every day, all the time, and kept repeating the word skinny when they talked about her. And what she confided in me that, you know what? I feel like the weirdo. I feel like the outcast because of everybody calling me that, everybody saying that. Again, everyone's perception was that was a good thing, that she wanted to hear that. The reality of it, quite difficult, quite painful. That's one of those I have on the list is the dangers of viewing people as healthy and going strictly off of looks, going strictly off of perception. That can also be dangerous to the individual themselves. Now, I was talking about the way my client felt when people talked about her being quote unquote skinny or looking that way, feeling that the outcast. But I've also seen situations where somebody hears that so many times they believe it themselves, and no matter what, they actually aren't healthy. A gentleman that I worked with several years ago, and he happened to be a physician. And before he even started with me, I heard so much about him from so many people that knew him. And they would just gushed about what an incredible shape he was in. And actually, to his credit, he was. He really was protective about his diet. He'd read a lot as far as nutrition was concerned. He was involved in karate. He was active all his life, did a lot of walking and what have you. When I started working with him, and I had one of my athletic trainers actually work with him, they found out that he was so weak that he really couldn't lift even an 8-pound dumbbell. And at 175 pounds at over 6 feet tall, we should be able to lift a 8-pound dumbbell. He had trouble getting out of a chair. Now, he was thin. He had done karate in his past, but he'd heard this so much that it was very difficult to tell this individual, hey, actually, we haven't been measuring it the correct way. We haven't been tracking it the correct way. And we've got some situations we need to work on. I followed him some years later, and actually it did bring about his demise. I'm sorry to hear that. And that's probably the reason why I'm doing this show on perception versus reality. And what I like to do is I like to share with you a few ways to deal with perception versus reality, especially when it comes to health and fitness. The water consumption, I think I've beat that to death soundly. And that is, of course, drinking water and keeping up with the rubber bands. I'm telling you.
How many ounces, Garrett?
I'm at 60 ounces today. I feel like I'm behind. By the end of the show, I'll be at 72 because I'm keeping up.
I can't remember. What was that number I'm supposed to take in every day?
Definitely over 100 ounces a day. Thank you so much for answering. I appreciate for asking. I appreciate that. It's like I don't talk about water enough, Pablo. That's the problem. Right? Yeah.
You never bring it up.
Never do. Exactly. So anyway, the rubber bands on the bottle, that's one way. But how about overeating? Well, it's very simple. In other words, track and remember how I feel about food. There's no such thing as bad food. And this perception versus reality is part of the reason why we go off on this tangent about it must be the food because I'm not overeating. It's got to be the bad food I'm having. Well, there's no such thing as bad food. You've heard me say that before, and you know it's true. And remember, if you don't think it's true, 251-341-0927, I'm here most days. Give me a call. Love to speak to you about it. And if you have anybody in the health field that is telling you there is good food and there is bad food, congratulations. They are lying to you, and tell them that Garrett Williamson, that is my full name. I have no middle name. Garrett Williamson said that about. But since the perception versus reality of overeating is why we get into that whole good food, bad food. Another reason why we do that. It's a simple way to find out whether or not you're overeating. Track your calories. And there are a myriad of different ways of doing it. My favorite is, you've heard me say it before, is MyFitnessPal. Log your food into MyFitnessPal. You'll find out quickly if you're overeating or not, no matter what type of food you're eating. So,
well, Garrett, I only ate a handful of the regular size Snicker bars, not the king size ones, so therefore I can't have been overeating.
Absolutely not. I mean, and handful is an exact measurement, right?
Right.
Of course, exactly.
Right. 3, 4, 7, I'm not sure.
It goes to my next thing. It's the dangers we get into about this ridiculous idea that light weights are the same thing as heavy weights. I cannot tell you how many times I hear that if just do light weights and high reps, it's the exact same thing. We'll have an entire show that I'm doing on frequency, intensity, time, and type. which is the different ways you measure and judge how your workout goes. But the problem with that is that I have people that literally believe that if I do 10 with a 20-pound dumbbell, then if I do 13 with an 8-pound, it's the same thing. Again, it's perception. It's this idea that what is light, what's heavy, and what have you. Knowing exact measurements is far more important. I'm getting a little bit off my subject there. But back to the overeating, tracking your calories through MyFitnessPal is the best way to figure out whether or not you're overeating.
I'd just like to point out, MyFitnessPal is not a sponsor of this show.
And why are they? I have no idea.
Like you say that because you actually use this and you actually believe in it.
Very dedicated to it. It's in part of our Catalyst program. I
Right.
mean, there's not a client that hasn't heard about that. So, guys, come on. Give us a call. Again, 251-341-0927. Love to hear from you. Absolutely.
You can sponsor this show.
Exactly. Absolutely. They'd love to have you. Absolutely. So, how active you are. Another way of perception versus reality. I started this whole podcast with that USC study talking about Dutch, English people, and Americans. But do you want to know how active you are? There are devices that measure that. And not just, I did 30 minutes today on the treadmill. That's good. That's fantastic. But what about the other activities you did? It's amazing how much you move and you don't know it, or how little you move and you don't know it. Garmin, Apple Watch, and my favorite, Fitbit. Fantastic way of tracking how active you are. It'll show you your calorie expenditure. And actually, you can marry your Fitbit. Hey, Fitbit, again, join MyFitnessPal. Get right behind them. Give me a call. I probably sold more of those things than your top salesperson because I talk about that. I think it's a fantastic device. But you can pair that device with your MyFitnessPal, and you can get a true calorie intake and calorie expenditure. You know exactly what you're doing. And hey, you know what probably would be really neat is that if you were able to do that, control your weight that way, maybe you could not worry about good food and bad food. Do you think that's a good way to lead people?
I think that's absolutely a good way to do that.
Right, we might consider that. So grab a pencil and make a mental note on maybe talking about the whole ridiculous idea of good food, bad food, and we just need to control amounts.
Yeah.
Maybe I can
maybe
even
even do
show.
like a little podcast series on them.
That's a good idea. Call it the live food.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's make a plan to do that. We ought to do that. Oh, wait a second.
Oh, yeah, I just looked up. Somebody's already done it.
I imagine that.
A couple of months back, yeah.
Right, that
Yeah.
Personalized Fitness podcast. So we ought to check that out sometime.
Those guys are smart.
Aren't they, though? So,
Well, I mean, that one guy anyway.
well, yeah, exactly. So, hey, Pablo, you do a good job. I have to agree.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thanks, man.
So, and then the last one I want to talk about is weightlifting and bulky muscles. Now, we're getting past this. This is one that we don't have as much difficulty as we used to, especially with female clientele worried about lifting weights and getting bulky muscles. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This was born out of early female bodybuilding. And early female bodybuilding, we're talking in the 60s, female bodybuilding. These ladies really, believe it or not, if you go back and look at some of the pictures, they really were not that big. They look that way because they're not standing by any point of reference that you're familiar with. And they have taken things or done such a restrictive starvation diet that they remove the level of fat that ladies have that makes that smooth appearance. Therefore, most people thought they were really big. And then, of course, in the 90s, they discovered steroids and they did become really big. And people thought, well, that's what happens when you lift weight. Absolutely not. In fact, you want to get slender, you want to get quote unquote toned. I'm actually doing a show on that particular word, but it's one that a lot of people understand. I know you want to get that toned look. Lifting weights does that. Resistance training does that. You don't possess the testosterone unless you're injecting it in yourself. You don't possess the testosterone to get those big, bulky muscles. Again, perception versus reality. And it's not just ladies that have the whole problem with doing resistance training or getting bulky muscles. This is taken for years to get golfers. This is a physical sport. Golfers to do resistance training. For the longest time, many of the senior golfers were completely against it because I love this phrase, I'm going to bulk up and therefore I won't be able to swing my club.
What?
I agree. As we talked about in flexibility and the podcast on muscle, a stronger muscle is a more flexible muscle. But then again, the person that really brought it to the forefront, Tiger Woods.
Yeah.
And how did that whole resistance training turn out for him? I mean, when he burst onto the scene.
7, 8, how many world championships is
Exactly. I think we ought to wait for the studies to come out, though. We don't want to jump to any hasty conclusions. This is why you see so many of them that are working out now. That same strange concept of bulky muscles or things that we perceive versus measuring versus reality versus telling the truth.
I remember coming up, I would hear coaches say something to the effect of, like basketball players, we don't want them in the weight room.
Right.
They should be lithe and skinny,
yes.
Thin, as well,
Right.
basketball players, because you lose your flexibility. Mm-hmm. And the same for pitchers in baseball.
Right.
And that's not right.
Exactly.
It doesn't stop LeBron James. I mean, he's swole as all get out. The dude's ripped, and it's worked out pretty well for him.
Right. Same thing with pitchers. You think the injuries have increased. Well, you think about the velocity of the pitches now. I mean, it's so much more than it used to be. It's so much better. But the shoulder injuries haven't jumped up. In fact, I believe they've gone down. But you would think that if the velocity is going up, then you're ripping shoulders out left, right, and center. Mm-hmm. That's not the case. Why? Because people are doing resistance training and starting to protect it. So anyway, really to sum up this whole thing, it sounds like kind of all over the place. But the more I thought about this perception versus reality, or perception versus measuring, I realized how dangerous it can be. And we address that in all of our personal training programs. We address the whole, in fact, when we're doing consultations with new clients, the perceptions that we see, which we spend most of our time putting those at bay. In our Catalyst Lifestyle Change program, it's a lot of perception versus reality that we deal with. Because the reality and the measuring and the accuracy gives you all those advantages you're looking for. They allow you to have whatever you want as far as your eating. They allow you to have a good balanced program and have the look you want, have the strength you want. Also, it allows for major, major efficiency. So don't waste your time with just perceiving. Get out there, track it, live the reality, and more importantly, I want everybody to live your own level of wellness.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.